The night was unusually quiet in the small suburban neighborhood, the kind of silence that made even the rustling leaves sound loud. Officer Daniels and Officer Ramirez sat in their patrol car, parked just outside a modest house with peeling paint and a slightly crooked mailbox. Dispatch had sent them here on what seemed like a routine call, a disturbance involving an elderly woman who refused to leave her home. Unpaid property taxes were the issue, or so they were told. Daniels, a grizzled veteran with over 20 years on the force, tapped his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel. He hated these kinds of calls. "It's always something," he muttered under his breath. "People think the world owes them everything." His tone was sharp, dismissive. Ramirez, younger and still idealistic, glanced at him but said nothing. He adjusted his uniform nervously, his eyes fixed on the house ahead. Something about this didn't sit right with him. As they stepped out of the car, the cool evening air hit them. A small group of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, whispering among themselves. Some shot worried glances toward the house while others openly stared at the officers. One man approached cautiously, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "She won't listen," he said, his voice low. "Keep saying this place is hers no matter what anyone says." Daniels frowned, unimpressed. "We'll handle it," he replied curtly before walking past the man. Ramirez lingered for a moment, catching snippets of hushed conversations. Words like stubborn and heartbreaking floated around, but there was also talk of corruption and unfairness. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't going to be as simple as they thought. When they reached the front door, it was locked tight. Through the frosted glass window, they could see movement inside. The elderly woman paced back and forth, clutching something close to her chest. Daniels knocked firmly, his knuckles rapping against the wood like a judge's gavel. "Ma'am, open up. We're here to help you resolve this situation peacefully." There was no answer, just the faint creak of floorboards as she moved farther, away from the door. Daniels tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. Frustration bubbled beneath his surface. He turned to Ramirez. "We don't have all night. Let's get this over with." Ramirez hesitated. "Maybe we should give her more time. She's probably scared." "She's breaking the law," Daniels snapped. "Scared or not, we can't let her ignore us." Reluctantly, Ramirez nodded. They called for backup to bring tools to force the door open. As they waited, Ramirez couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. The neighbors' whispers echoed in his mind. Why would an old woman put herself through this? What was she holding on to so tightly? Finally, the door gave way with a loud crack. The two officers stepped inside, their boots thudding heavily on the worn carpet. The smell of old books and lavender filled the air. In the dim light, they saw her standing by the fireplace, frail but resolute. Her gray hair framed her face like a halo, and her eyes burned with defiance. Clutched in her arms was a framed photograph, its edges worn from years of love and care. "Please," she said softly, her voice trembling but steady. "You don't understand." Daniels took a step forward, his patience wearing thin. But Ramirez hung back, his instinct screaming that this wasn't just another case. Whatever was about to happen next, he knew, would change everything. For all of them. The room was heavy with tension, the kind that made it hard to breathe. The elderly woman stood frozen, her grip tightening around the framed photograph as if it were a lifeline. Officer Daniels moved closer, his boots scraping against the faded carpet. His shadow loomed over her, and for a moment she seemed smaller than before, fragile, almost breakable. But there was something in her eyes that refused to yield, a quiet strength that unnerved even Daniels. "Ma'am," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You're breaking the law. You can't stay here. This isn't your decision anymore." He took another step forward, towering over her now. "Hand over whatever you're holding and let's get this sorted." But she didn't move. Instead, she began speaking. Not yelling or pleading, but talking in a tone so calm it felt deliberate, almost rehearsed. "This house," she started, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "This house belonged to my husband. He gave everything for this town for people like you." Her gaze locked onto Daniel's, daring him to look away. "And now they want to take it from me? For what? Because I couldn't pay some papers on time?" Daniels rolled his eyes, unimpressed by her words. To him, this was just another excuse, another delay tactic. "That's not how this works," he shot back. "You knew the rules when you signed up for this property. If you can't keep up, then—" Before he could finish, Ramirez interrupted, his voice softer but firm. "Sir, maybe we should hear her out. She's clearly upset." "I don't care if she's upset," Daniel snapped, turning to glare at his partner. "We're here to do a job, not play therapist." The sharpness of his words hung in the air, but Ramirez didn't back down. He glanced at the woman again, noticing how tightly she clutched the photograph. It wasn't fear in her expression. It was defiance mixed with something else. Sadness, anger. Whatever it was, it tugged at Ramirez's conscience. He couldn't ignore it. Meanwhile, the elderly woman continued, her voice rising slightly as if she were trying to push past Daniels's dismissive attitude. "They promised us," she said, her tone bitter now. "Years ago, after my husband died saving lives during that flood, they promised no one would ever take this home from me. And now?" She let out a hollow laugh. "Now they send you to drag me out? Is this justice?" Her words lingered in the air, unanswered. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond without losing control of the situation. He decided action was better than debate. With a quick motion, he reached out, intending to grab the photograph from her hands. "Enough talk," he growled. "Give me that." But she pulled away instinctively, stumbling backward until her knees hit the edge of an old armchair. She fell onto them with a soft thud, still clutching the frame. For a brief second, everyone froze. Even Daniels paused, surprised by what he'd done. The sight of this frail woman forced to her knees under his command sent a ripple through the room. Ramirez stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Sir, that's enough," he said firmly, his voice louder than usual. "We don't need to do this. We can figure this out without—" "Stay out of it, Ramirez," Daniels barked, though there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He turned back to the woman who hadn't moved. Tears streamed down her face, but she wasn't crying in defeat. Her jaw was set, her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked up at him, her gaze piercing. "You think you're doing the right thing," she whispered, her voice shaking but clear. "But you have no idea what's really going on here." For a moment, the room felt impossibly small. Daniels opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out. Something about her words stopped him cold. Beside him, Ramirez watched silently, his mind racing. What had they walked into? And why did it feel like the truth was hiding just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered? No one spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the house, counting down to whatever revelation lay ahead. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of the elderly woman's labored breathing. She remained on her knees, her hands trembling but still clutching the photograph tightly to her chest. Her tears had stopped, replaced by an eerie calm that seemed to fill the space around her. It was as if she had accepted her fate, yet refused to surrender. Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado faltering under the weight of what he'd just done. Forcing an elderly woman to her knees wasn't something he could easily brush off, no matter how much he tried to justify it as part of the job. He glanced at Ramirez, whose expression was unreadable, but clearly troubled. The tension between them was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. "Ma'am," Daniels said finally, his voice quieter now, less commanding. "We're here because of unpaid taxes. That's all this is about. If you cooperate, we can work something out." But the woman interrupted him, her voice steady despite the raw emotion etched into her face. "Work something out?" she repeated almost bitterly. "You think this is just about money? Do you even know who my husband was?" Ramirez stepped forward slightly, sensing an opening. "Tell us," he urged gently, his tone respectful and sincere. "Help us understand." She hesitated for a moment, staring at both officers as if weighing whether they deserved the truth. Finally, she sighed and began to speak, her words slow and deliberate. My husband, he saved lives during the flood 20 years ago. Not just one or two, he helped dozens of families escape when the river overflowed. He worked tirelessly day and night until... Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. Until he collapsed from exhaustion. They found him, hours later, too late to save him. Daniels frowned, unsure where this story was headed. But Ramirez listened intently, his heart sinking as he realized the depth of her pain. This wasn't just about property taxes, it was about loss, betrayal, and promises broken. They told me then, she continued, her voice gaining strength, that his sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. They promised me I'd never lose this home. This house was everything to him. It's where we raised our children, where we dreamed of growing old together. She paused, looking down at the photograph in her hands. And now, after all these years, they come knocking at my door, saying I owe them money? Money I don't have? Her words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but Ramirez spoke first. That's not fair, he admitted softly. If what you're saying is true. It is true, she snapped, surprising them both with the sudden sharpness in her tone. Then more quietly she added, and there's more. Things they don't want anyone to know. Daniels crossed his arms, skeptical. What kind of things? The woman hesitated again, glancing toward the floorboards near the fireplace. She leaned forward slightly, wincing as she pushed herself back to her feet. Both officers instinctively moved to help her, but she waved them off. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. There's proof hidden here. Documents that show exactly what they've done, how they've taken homes like mine, lied to people, stolen from them. My husband uncovered some of it before he died, and I kept it safe. For years, I've waited for someone to listen. Ramirez exchanged a glance with Daniels, who looked torn between disbelief and curiosity. Proof of what? Daniels demanded, his skepticism evident. Corruption? She replied simply, her eyes locking onto his. Not just here, but everywhere. Powerful people covering their tracks, using laws to hurt those who can't fight back. And now? She gestured weakly to herself. Now they're coming for me because they think I'll stay quiet. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room felt smaller than ever, the air charged with possibility. Daniels rubbed the back of his neck, visibly uneasy. Ramirez, however, felt a spark of determination ignite within him. If even half of what she said was true, they couldn't walk away, not without finding out. Where are the documents? Ramirez asked carefully, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. The woman pointed to a loose floorboard near the hearth. Under there, she said, but be careful. Once you see it, there's no going back. As Daniels and Ramirez stared at each other, the gravity of the situation settled over them. Whatever lay beneath that floorboard, it would change everything for better or worse. The room seemed to hold its breath as the two officers stood frozen, their eyes locked on the loose floorboard near the fireplace. The elderly woman's words echoed in their minds: corruption, stolen homes, powerful people covering their tracks. It was hard to believe, but the look in her eyes told them she wasn't lying. This wasn't just about unpaid taxes anymore. It was something much bigger, darker, and far more dangerous. Officer Daniels was the first to break the silence. You expect us to trust you? He asked, his tone sharp but laced with uncertainty. This could be a trick, some sob story to buy time. The woman didn't flinch. She met his gaze head-on, her voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into her face. If I wanted to trick you, I wouldn't have told you where the documents are, she said simply. Go ahead, check for yourself. But remember, you asked for this. Daniels hesitated, glancing at Ramirez, who had already taken a step toward the fireplace. There was no fear in Ramirez's expression, only determination. Sir, we can't ignore this, he said firmly. If there's even a chance she's telling the truth. Daniels cut him off with a wave of his hand. And if she's not? Then what? We've wasted time, resources, and made fools of ourselves over nothing. But what if she is telling the truth? Ramirez pressed, his voice rising slightly. What if those papers prove everything she's saying? People like her, people who've lost everything, are counting on us to do the right thing. Isn't that why we took this job? Daniels opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. He looked away, his jaw tightening as he wrestled with his thoughts. Deep down, he knew Ramirez was right, but admitting it felt like losing control of the situation. For years, Daniels had prided himself on following orders without question, on being the kind of officer who got results no matter what. Now, faced with something that didn't fit neatly into black and white rules, he felt unmoored. While Daniels struggled internally, Ramirez knelt by the fireplace and reached for the loose floorboard. His fingers brushed against the edge, pulling it up carefully. Beneath it lay a small metal box, rusted but intact. He exchanged a glance with the woman, who nodded silently, urging him to open it. Inside the box were stacks of yellowed papers, folders marked with official seals and a few old photographs. Ramirez picked up one of the documents and skimmed through it, his brow furrowing as he read. Names, dates, transactions, it all pointed to something shady, something illegal. High-ranking officials, forged signatures, and evidence of embezzlement stared back at him in cold black ink. This is real, Ramirez muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He held up the document for Daniels to see. Look at this, sir. It's proof. They've been using property laws to steal from people like her. Daniels hesitated before taking the paper, his hands trembling slightly as he scanned it. His skepticism began to crack, replaced by a growing sense of unease. What they held in their hands wasn't just incriminating, it was explosive. If this got out, heads would roll, careers would end, and lives would change forever. But along with the unease came anger, not at the woman, but at the system they'd sworn to serve. How many others had suffered because of this? How many stories, like hers, had been silenced? We can't just walk away from this, Ramirez said quietly, breaking the tense silence. We have to do something. Daniels exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. Doing something means putting ourselves in the line of fire, he replied, his voice heavy with reluctance. People like us don't win when we go up against people like them. Then maybe it's time we started trying, Ramirez shot back, his tone firm. Are we really going to stand here and let this happen, or are we going to fight for what's right? For a long moment, Daniels didn't answer. He glanced at the elderly woman who stood watching them with quiet hope, then at the documents in his hand. Finally, he nodded slowly, though his expression remained grim. All right, he said, his voice low. Let's figure this out, but don't say I didn't warn you. This isn't going to be easy. As the weight of their decision settled over them, the room seemed lighter, as if the truth had begun to push back the shadows. Whatever happened next, they knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. The room was alive with tension, the kind that made every breath feel deliberate and every movement heavy with consequence. Officer Daniels stood near the fireplace, clutching one of the documents in his hand as if it might burn him. His face was a mix of frustration and disbelief, while Ramirez paced back and forth, his mind racing with possibilities. The elderly woman sat quietly on the edge of her worn armchair, her eyes fixed on the two officers. She looked exhausted but hopeful, like someone who had spent years waiting for this moment. We can't handle this alone, Daniels finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost reluctant, as though admitting it pained him. This isn't some local dispute, it's bigger than us. Ramirez stopped pacing and turned to face him. So what do we do? Just ignore it and walk away? Pretend we never saw these papers? Daniels shot him a sharp look. I didn't say that, but going straight to the top with this, it's risky. People involved in something like this, they don't play fair. They'll bury us before we even get a chance to speak. Before Ramirez could respond, there was a knock at the door. All three of them froze, startled by the sudden interruption. The neighbors outside had long since dispersed, So whoever was knocking now wasn't part of the earlier crowd. Daniels moved cautiously toward the entrance, motioning for Ramirez to stay put. He peeked through the peephole and relaxed slightly when he recognized the man standing outside. Mr. Harper, the retired journalist who lived 2 houses down. Harper raised his hands in a gesture of peace as Daniels opened the door. "I heard about what's happening here," he said without preamble. His voice was calm but urgent. "And I think I can help." Daniels frowned, suspicious. "Help how? This is police business." "It's more than that," Harper interrupted, gently. "Look, I've been investigating cases like this for years. Stories of corruption, property theft, families losing everything because of shady deals. When I saw you two come in tonight, I knew something big was going on." He glanced past Daniels into the room, his gaze landing briefly on the elderly woman. "If she says she has evidence, then trust me, you're sitting on something explosive." Ramirez stepped forward, curiosity overtaking caution. "You know about this stuff?" Harper nodded. "More than I'd like to. I used to write exposés before I retired. Things got complicated." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But if you let me see those documents, I can verify them. And if they're legit, which I suspect they are, I can make sure the truth gets out, safely." Daniels crossed his arms, skeptical. "Why should we trust you? For all we know, you could be trying to stir up trouble." Harper smiled faintly, unperturbed by the accusation. "Because I have nothing to gain and everything to lose if this goes south. My reputation's already ruined. But if we work together, we can expose the people responsible. That's worth fighting for." The elderly woman spoke up suddenly, her voice soft but firm. "Mr. Harper's a good man," she said. "He helped me once before when no one else would listen. If anyone can help us, it's him." Daniels hesitated, glancing at Ramirez, who gave a slight nod. Finally, Daniels sighed and stepped aside, letting Harper enter. The retired journalist walked over to the fireplace where Ramirez handed him one of the documents. Harper adjusted his glasses and began reading, his expression growing darker with each passing second. "This is bad," he murmured after a few moments. "Really bad. These aren't just isolated incidents. They're part of a pattern. Someone's been using loopholes in the law to target vulnerable homeowners, forcing them out quietly and pocketing the profits." He looked up at the group, his eyes grim. "If we release this information, it'll blow the lid off everything." "But how?" Daniels asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "Even if we take this public, they'll try to shut us down. Threats, lawsuits, whatever it takes." Harper nodded knowingly. "That's why we need to be smart about it. Leak it to trusted reporters, share it with watchdog groups, make copies and spread it wide. Once the story's out there, they won't be able to stop it." Ramirez looked at Daniels, determination shining in his eyes. "We have to try," he said. "For her, for everyone else they've hurt." Daniels stared at the floor for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice heavy with resolve. "Let's do this. But remember, one wrong move, and we're done for." As Harper began organizing the documents, the weight of their decision settled over them. They were stepping into dangerous territory, but for the first time that night, hope flickered in the air, a fragile, defiant light pushing back against the darkness. The room buzzed with quiet urgency as Mr. Harper spread the documents across the dining table, his hands moving methodically. The yellowed papers and faded ink seemed insignificant at first glance, but to him, they were a treasure trove of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Officer Ramirez hovered nearby, watching intently as Harper sorted through the files, occasionally jotting notes on a small notepad he'd pulled from his coat pocket. Daniel stood by the window, arms crossed, his eyes darting between the street outside and the activity inside. His jaw was clenched, betraying the storm of thoughts brewing beneath his stoic exterior. "This is worse than I thought," Harper muttered, shaking his head as he examined one particularly damning document. It outlined a series of transactions involving fake shell companies used to siphon money meant for public housing projects. These people, they've been playing a long game. Years of cover-ups, bribes, and backdoor deals, and now He glanced at the elderly woman, who sat silently at the far end of the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Now, they've come after you because you're the last person standing in their way. Ramirez leaned forward, his voice tinged with disbelief. But how did they think they could get away with this? Someone had to notice. Someone always notices. Harper gave a humorless chuckle. That's the thing about power, son. When you're high enough up the ladder, no one asks questions. They rewrite the rules, silence dissenters, and make sure anyone who tries to speak out disappears quietly. He tapped one of the folders. Your friend here, he gestured toward the elderly woman, wasn't supposed to survive this long. Most others crumble under pressure or give up when threatened, but she held on. That takes guts. Daniels turned away from the window, his frustration boiling over. Great. So we're dealing with untouchables. What's our next move? Hand deliver these to the mayor's office and hope we don't vanish overnight? No, Harper replied, firmly. We hit them where it hurts, their reputation. If we leak this information carefully, we can turn public opinion against them. People hate corruption more than anything else. Once the press gets hold of this, there'll be no stopping the fallout. But how do we protect ourselves? Daniels asked sharply. You think they won't come after us once they realize what we're doing? They will, Harper admitted without hesitation. Which is why we need to act fast and smart. Make copies of everything. Spread them to multiple sources. Journalists, activists, even online forums. By the time they figure out what's happening, it'll be too late to stop it. Ramirez nodded slowly, absorbing the plan. And if something happens to us, at least the truth will still get out. The gravity of his words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For a moment, no one spoke. The elderly woman finally broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. I never wanted any of this to happen, she said, looking at each of them, in turn. All I ever wanted was to keep my home, to honor my husband's memory. But if sharing this means helping others like me, then I'm willing to take that risk. Her courage struck a chord in all three men. Daniels sighed deeply, running a hand over his face. All right, he said gruffly. Let's do it. But let's not kid ourselves. This is going to change everything. There's no going back once we set this in motion. Harper nodded, already gathering the documents into neat piles. Then let's make sure it's worth it. Over the next hour, the group worked tirelessly. They made photocopies using an old machine in the corner of the house, saved digital scans onto a USB drive, and divided the evidence among themselves. Each step felt monumental, as though they were building a fragile bridge across a chasm of danger. The weight of their actions settled heavily on their shoulders, but there was also a strange sense of purpose, a shared determination to see this through. When they finally finished, Ramirez looked around the room, his chest tightening with both fear and resolve. What happens now? He asked quietly. Harper smiled faintly, his expression grim but hopeful. Now, we wait, and pray we're ready for whatever comes next. As the night wore on, none of them noticed the faint glow of headlights pulling up outside, or the shadowy figures stepping out of the car. Time was running out and the stakes were higher than ever. The faint hum of an engine outside broke the quiet determination in the room. Officer Daniels, who had been pacing near the window, froze mid-step. His eyes narrowed as he peeked through the curtains, his heart sinking at what he saw. Two unmarked cars had pulled up to the curb, their headlights cutting through the darkness like spotlights. Men in sharp suits stepped out, moving with purpose toward the house. Daniels turned quickly, his voice tight with urgency. We've got company, he whispered, gesturing for the others to stay low. Ramirez's stomach dropped. He glanced at Harper, who was still organizing the final batch of documents, and then at the elderly woman whose face had gone pale. Who are they? Ramirez asked, though deep down he already knew the answer. They're here for the papers, Harper replied grimly, shoving the USB drive into his pocket. They must have found out somehow. Panic threatened to take over, but Daniels snapped them back to focus. No time to figure that out now. We need to move fast. He scanned the room, his mind racing, The front door was a no-go. The men would reach it any second. That left only one option, the back exit. Through the kitchen, he ordered, motioning for everyone to follow. "Harper, keep those documents safe. Ramirez, help her." He nodded toward the elderly woman who looked too shaken to stand on her own. As they moved swiftly toward the rear of the house, the sound of heavy boots stomping onto the porch sent a jolt of adrenaline through all of them. A loud knock echoed through the walls, followed by a commanding voice. "Open up! Police investigation!" Daniels cursed under his breath. These weren't ordinary cops. They were enforcers, the kind who didn't play by the rules. He locked the kitchen door behind them just as the front door splintered open with a crash. "We can't let them catch us with this stuff," Harper said urgently, clutching the folder tightly. "If they find it, we're done. And if they find us, we're dead," Daniel shot back, his tone harsh but not without truth. The group hurried into the backyard, where shadows offered some cover. The elderly woman stumbled, her frail body unable to keep up with their pace, but Ramirez caught her arm, steadying her. "Stay close," he murmured, guiding her forward. A shout from inside the house signaled that their pursuers had realized they weren't alone. Footsteps thundered, closer, accompanied by the flicker of flashlights sweeping through the windows. Daniels spotted a narrow alleyway between two neighboring houses and pointed toward it. "That way! Move!" They sprinted across the yard, hearts pounding as the shouts grew louder. Just as they reached the alley, a flashlight beam sliced through, the darkness narrowly missing them. Ramirez pushed the elderly woman ahead, shielding her with his body. Harper clutched the documents tighter, sweat dripping down his forehead despite the cool night air. "Split up," Daniels hissed. "It'll buy us more time. Meet at Harper's place. He knows the safest route." No one argued. Harper veered left, disappearing into the maze of streets while Daniels stayed behind to create a diversion. Ramirez kept moving, half dragging the elderly woman along until they reached Harper's front door. Panting, they slipped inside, locking it securely. Minutes later, Daniels arrived, winded but alive. "They won't stop looking," he warned, his voice grim. "Not until they get what they came for." Harper nodded, pulling out his phone. "Then we don't give them the chance. I'm sending everything to my contacts right now. Once it's out there, it's out of our hands." As the files uploaded, none of them spoke. Fear, exhaustion, and resolve mingled in the cramped living room. They had gambled everything, knowing full well the cost of failure, but even as sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, they felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever happened next, they had done the right thing. And sometimes, that was enough. The next morning, the town woke up to chaos. Headlines blared across every news outlet. Massive corruption scandal rocks local government. Powerful officials implicated in property theft scheme. And elderly woman Stan Sparks' nationwide outcry. The documents Harper had leaked overnight had spread like wildfire, igniting outrage among citizens who had long suspected something was wrong, but never had proof. For Officer Daniels and Ramirez, the fallout was immediate. Their faces appeared on television screens alongside grainy security footage from the neighborhood, though their identities remained anonymous for now. Internal investigations were launched into their involvement, and both officers were placed on administrative leave pending review. But instead of fear or regret, they felt a strange sense of relief. For once, they hadn't turned a blind eye. They had stood up, even when it meant risking everything. Harper became an unexpected hero. His name surfaced as the whistleblower behind the leak, and while he braced himself for retaliation, public support poured in. Journalists hailed him as a champion of justice, and watchdog groups rallied around him, ensuring his safety. He gave interviews from safe locations, explaining how years of digging had led him to uncover similar cases, but none as explosive as this one. As for the elderly woman, she became a symbol of resilience. Neighbors who had once whispered about her defiance now openly praised her courage. Her story inspired others to come forward with their own tales of unfair evictions and broken promises. A crowdfunding campaign was started to pay off her property taxes, raising more than enough within hours. Strangers sent letters, flowers, and messages of gratitude, thanking her for standing firm when it mattered most. But the real victory came, weeks later, when arrests began. High-ranking officials implicated in the scandal were taken into custody, their polished reputations crumbling under the weight of evidence. Lawsuits followed, demanding accountability not just for the victims of the scheme but for decades of systemic abuse. Reform bills were introduced, promising stricter oversight and protections for vulnerable homeowners. Daniels and Ramirez watched it all unfold from the sidelines, waiting for their fate to be decided. They knew they might lose their badges and, perhaps even face charges. But they also knew they couldn't have done anything differently. One evening, after another long day of questioning, they sat together in silence outside the station. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You think we did the right thing?" Daniels finally asked, breaking the quiet. Ramirez smiled faintly. "I know we did." Daniels nodded slowly, his usual gruff demeanor softened by the events of the past weeks. "Never thought I'd say this, but thanks for pushing me. I wouldn't have had the guts otherwise." Ramirez chuckled. "That's what partners are for." A few days later, Ramirez visited the elderly woman at her home. She greeted him warmly, her eyes brighter than they had been in months. Together, they walked through the house, which now felt alive again, like the spirit of her husband lingered in every corner. She stopped by the fireplace, running her fingers over the loose floorboard where the documents had been hidden for so long. "Always told myself I was keeping them safe for him," she said softly. "Now I realize I was keeping them safe for everyone." Ramirez nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "You saved us all, ma'am. We're just glad we listened." She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you, young man, for believing in me when no one else would." As he left her house that evening, Ramirez paused on the sidewalk, watching the sunset cast golden light over the neighborhood. It wasn't perfect. There were still battles to fight, wounds to heal. But for the first time in a long while, hope seemed possible. Justice wasn't always swift or easy, but sometimes, when people dared to stand together, it found its way home.